Well, good morning, everybody. We're back into the text of 1 Corinthians. We're in chapter 13 right now, and it's great to have Steve with us. It's good to see Terry again. Steve, how are you doing today?
We're doing good. It's warming up even in Chicago. We might get above 40 degrees by the afternoon.
Well, it's been more than 40 here for a while, but it is still a little seasonally cold for the southeast. Terry, you doing fine?
Doing good. It's a little bit warmer than that here, so that's a good thing. We're supposed to get up almost to 90 this weekend down here in Alabama, which is great news.
Yeah, I have an underutilized snow shovel, Steve, if you want to borrow it. I don't think I've done anything other than, scrape up some leaves with it since we moved down here.
Well, 40s is shirt sleeve weather up here, so we don't need snow blowers when it gets that warm.
It's all about perspective. Let's dig into the text a little bit. We're going to be in chapter 13. We'll begin in verse 1 in a moment. A few cursory reminders. Remember, we're talking about the full experience of Paul with the church at Corinth, even though we're focusing in on the first letter at this point. We've recognized his early interactions with them. We've paid attention to all of the text up to this point, identifying the conflict that we can find at Corinth. And then around chapter 4, Paul begins to explain wise solutions that will bring resolution in all of these different components of their relationship to one another, both with the personal relationships expanded to the congregational relationships, and seen most specifically in the relationship to the Lord. And all of that finds part of its fulfillment or conclusion around chapter 10, but then chapter 11, 12, 13, and following into the introduction of the closing parts of 14 in some ways, Paul then reinvestigates some of the root causes for these challenges in some ways, talking about the specific aspect of their worship together and the specific aspect of the manifestation of this problem. And it impacted their understanding of how God was gifting and blessing them. So let's go ahead and dig in the text then. Terry, if you could for us, why don't you read just verses 1 through 3 at this time?
All right. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all that I have, if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing.
So, what are some things that are important for us to understand in the text right here, in maybe the preamble to his argument? What are some of the key phrases, and also maybe identifying some misunderstandings that sometimes take place in what these terms, words, concepts mean? Terry or Steve, start us off. Whoever gets to speak first gets to speak most.
Well, I guess the first impression, and maybe one thing that people who come from a perspective that these gifts have ended, which I do, but I think sometimes we tend to magnify this and say love is great and these gifts are nothing. Well, these were good gifts. And Paul says some are better than others. You need to strive for the greater gift. But this is what God gave to the church, to Christians, and particularly in a time when the New Testament had not yet been fully recorded and written down, and was certainly not available widely in written form, to have prophetic utterances, to have people who were given the ability to proclaim the mind of God, to have people who could translate from one language to another, or interpret even the content of what was said. These are important gifts, but of course the overall point of it is, I want to show you something better. And particularly the application seems to be, if you think having one of these great gifts, and they are in the scope, and they're praised in the scripture, they're desirable gifts. But if you think being able to speak in a tongue, or you think being able to interpret, or whatever, you think being a messenger from God makes you something special, then you need a serious attitude adjustment. I mean, I think that seems to be the main point, is that whatever I do, and even if it's not necessarily something miraculous, if I, give my body to be burned, as we know from Hebrews in the Old Testament, and even maybe intertestamentary period with the Maccabees, maybe in Paul's background here, if you give whatever you have, and you don't do that out of a proper motivation, out of love, and I like the New American Standard here, it profits me nothing. If you're looking for profit, you're you're looking for return on investment here, or you think this magnifies you, then you are sadly mistaken.
When I read, and I like what you brought up, these are good gifts. I mean, we're not emphasizing love to the exclusion of the gifts. He's emphasizing love as the greater gift. And for me, I'm an old band nerd. I know Phil is too. Verse 1 is the one that always sticks out to me, because if you were in a band room and a cymbal fell or a gong gets hit the wrong way, there's nothing that can be worse in a lot of ways. Break up whatever's going on. And yet both of those instruments used in the right time and in the right way are well done. Try taking the cymbals out of the national anthem. Whenever you hear that, they're used for great emphasis. And even the gong, I mean, Phil was a percussionist. There's a right way and a wrong way to play the gong. I mean, if you're not a musician, you don't know that. You got to prime that for it to sound right. And so in a lot of ways, just looking at that, what he's saying is, hey, these gifts are great when used correctly and with the right spirit, but when used incorrectly with the wrong spirit, they're not great anymore. And I just think that's interesting to kind of see that from that text.
He also seems to be emphasizing here, is not just that I've become like this, but if I'm interested in me, and this makes me great, or the focus is on me, because I have insider knowledge, or I'm yucking it up with the guys, or I have some great gift that I can pass off as from God, whether it actually is from God or not. But I think this exalts me. Then I'm not only like the drop cymbal in the band room, I have become something worthless like that. My own modern translation is, I have become the cowbell.
No. There's times we need more cowbell.
Well, there are times for that, just like there, as you say, there's a time for a cymbal and a gong. But if I am misusing my gifts or misusing what God, I mean, another perspective to just go back to the word gift. This is something that was given, whatever it is, whatever the gift may be. It doesn't exalt me. It was something that was given to me. It doesn't make me great, like somehow, I did this great thing. If I were to develop a, standing 48-inch vertical leap, that's whoever has that, guys that have that, it's not, I mean, they were given that. They were born with that gift, and you can hone it, of course, but I could practice my standing vertical leap all day long. I'm not ever going to get close to 48 inches or whatever the gold standard for that is. So I have to recognize that whatever God has given me ought to humble me, rather than pretend like, hey, this makes me something great. What it makes me is like the drop cymbal or the too much cowbell.
Right. There's some interesting language I see in the text here. Terry's right. I come from a music background. The first instrument I learned was trombone. The second instrument was saxophone. And then percussion came as the third level thing. I remember going from practicing saxophone at home, where I was already banished to the outer camp of the house, made to practice on my own. I showed up for a rehearsal for the first time playing the alto in the ensemble, and I only knew one volume, loud. And that was all about me. And there's the reason I bring that. And again, Mr. Burleson banished me to the outside of the camp there in middle school and said, "No, you got to go back again and learn some more." The term that's clanging here, alalazo, is a word that is really paying attention to itself in some ways. It's to raise the war cry, to shout victory, to cry or shout aloud. In essence, it's really just like, pay attention to me, is the word concept under there. I've got something to tell you. And so I love when Paul does this. He uses terminology that says, in essence, the same thing in another layer. because that's what the Corinthians seem to be doing. And they're making it about them and less about God and less about, as Steve pointed out, the deep reality that this was a blessing from God. This is something that, in and of itself, no matter where they were on the scale of good, better, best, God gave them something that wasn't for all mankind, certainly wasn't for all mankind throughout history. There's a limited nature of this work, no matter what generation you're in. And that in and of itself makes it utterly amazing. And they had turned it into utter nonsense, really, with their shift.
Just to complete the percussive brotherhood here, I actually started on snare drum. I don't know whether I had, this is third grade, maybe I had visions of drum corps, I don't know, but I was banished by my mother and either punished or rewarded by switching to the violin. So I get the context of what Paul is saying here.
Right.
Well,
the point is, it's too much of a good thing that I'm trying to exalt myself.
Blue Devils, conquer Blue Devils all the time, all the wins, and we're back.
I was a
Phantom Regiment.
by the way, I was a trumpet converted to tuba player and then played trombone and eventually played percussion stuff. But I know why he went from trombone to sax and he was loud all the time, because that's what low brass does. That's our only volume, is loud.
On.
So.
Yeah.
That's good if you're doing Finlandia. I don't know about other things.
So let's kind of extend the text a little bit. I think Shirley made a great comment that your heart, your love, and your motivation of your actions matter. And they absolutely do. What undergirds the choice you make with the blessings that God has given you will really determine the value of its outcome. Is it going to be profitable? Is it going to be encouraging? Is it going to be strengthening? Or is it going to be destructive and divisive? The same tools can accomplish the same outcomes. Terry, you want to read the familiar text, verses 4 through 7 for us?
Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things.
How many of you have either read this or heard it read at a wedding? Why do we do that? And then what does it have, as we reflect back into what Paul's doing, why do we use it in one context when we pulled it out of this setting, and what's the sense we're trying to accomplish from that?
Well, generally I do it because the couple asked me to.
Fair answer.
But this is one of those passages, and there are a lot of passages that could be applied to a couple. We use this sometimes in our premarital and even post-marital marriage or post-marriage ceremony counseling with couples, because it really defines the right kind of spirit in a relationship and the way you should treat each other. Now, let me say this: Philippians 2, 3, and 4 really does the same thing in a much more succinct way. This idea of putting others above yourself, and I think that's one of the things that's pretty interesting. But I think one of the dangers is that sometimes we only apply 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 7 to marriages. And that's not the context of this. The context of this is much broader than that. This is how we're supposed to be. I mean, the reality is, in the context, we could limit that to with our brethren, but really and truthfully, as Christians, we're supposed to be this way with everyone. We're supposed to love all men this way. And that's the greater context, I think, in all of this.
Can I try something here? Two things, actually, and we may want to revisit this, but one of the more effective ways to read this is to read it and insert your own name.
Yes.
Steve is patient. Steve is kind. Steve is not jealous. Steve does not brag, is not arrogant, so forth. The other thing, and I'm playing off a comment by Thistleton here, that maybe I am not a fan of the message, but sometimes they do, but he does a passage effectively. And I think you've read in conjunction with other passages like Terry, what was that ESV you were reading from, Terry?
Yes.
But try this. first of all, it's set off as a poem. I mean, a lot of scholars who study this think this is a hymn, or at least an embedded hymn where Paul is quoting or using something that early Christians would be familiar with as hymnic material. But to read it in a different tone sometimes helps us understand the text. So here's the rendering, all set off in different lines. Love never gives up. Love cares more for others than for self. Love doesn't want what it doesn't have. Love doesn't strut, doesn't have a swelled head, doesn't force itself on others, isn't always me first, doesn't fly off the handle, doesn't keep score of the sins of others, doesn't revel when others grovel, takes pleasure in the flowering of truth, puts up with anything, trusts God always, looks for the best always, never looks back, but keeps going to the end. Now, I don't know if that's dynamic equivalence. It's rough concept equivalence anyway. But I think sometimes stepping back and getting a different lens to look at a passage that we know so well that sometimes we miss the nuance because we've heard it read at weddings or we've heard it in sermons from the more standard translation. So I'll just put that on the table and leave it there.
For those who are interested, I mean, I own that copy of the translation. I'm bringing it up into the feed so they can see it a second time. So it should start to show up for everybody here. And they can kind of see it how it's set off. As Steve was talking about, it's set up in a poetic format, which is real familiar to us if we think about how the Psalms are laid out that way. A lot of the Psalms are structured more as poetry would be rather than just block text. And like Steve, I think the message sometimes is really interesting. Sometimes I think it might be really good in certain segments, and sometimes I don't understand the methodology.
Yes.
I think
sometimes it's just a source of humor, frankly, but it's hard to be wrong 100% of the time.
Yeah.
You have to work really hard to get everything wrong. And I encourage people to read from different translations, not this one all the time, but
yeah.
I think sometimes it does give you a different perspective, even when you're thinking, man, this is really wrong.
Right. And I'll add a couple things that I think are important in the connectedness of seeing it in the marital context, the relationship context, because that's kind of where Paul is pointing. This is a relationship that the brethren at Corinth should be building and continuing to build, much like a marriage. An important reality to kind of connect. This is directed to those who are not yet married or may seek to be married in the future. The person you walk down the aisle with is not the wife you will have 20 years down the road, the husband you'll have 20 years down the road. They will change. You will change. They are the person they are today. And if you want it to have a great relationship, you got to build it. And so I think in this text is a reminder that the brethren at Corinth had either not built it or allowed it to crumble. And this context here is kind of reestablishing the basic principles of how you treat one another in all contexts. And in the specific one, it's certainly applicable to this puffed up attitude of I'm the man, I'm the one, it's all about me, it's not about any y'all. So what are some, with that kind of connected point, in the application of verses, right now just 4 to 7, although you could make a case that the verse should probably end at the first half of verse 8. This whole block might end better that way. What are some application points, first for the church at Corinth, and then secondly for us, that we need to pay attention to understand this message and to see what Paul is teaching us?
Well, there's a good chance, as divided as they are, that this list may be very purposefully chosen with these characteristics. Because when you think about, so take it back to marriage, as you said, when I sit down with a couple, my wife and I, and they're having issues, it's usually some combination of these things in verses 4 through 7. That is what's caused the relationship to decay to some degree. And truthfully, it usually starts off with the fact of seeking my own way rather than seeking my spouse's way. Well, you take that and you apply that, as you said, that's a good illustration for the relationships they should have as the body that was mentioned in chapter 12, as we studied yesterday. And how they're members of one another. There's a lot of that one flesh concept. There's a lot of tie-ins there, right? Well, so the application is that the reason they're divided is for these reasons. And I can see how you read through this list, and I can see how these divisions and the things that have manifested out of them in this letter have violated it, these specific things in almost every way, which, by the way, is the same application for us today. I'll go ahead and jump there and just say, you know, I'm like a fourth generation Christian, grew up in the church. This is kind of all I've ever known. And for years, from especially my teenage years forward, not as common lately, but there was a long time, and I know Steve knows this, and Phil, you do too, but Steve probably more familiar. A lot of churches was split, and the way we described that was, truthfully, most of the times it was a personality issue. And truthfully, when you have a personality issue split in a church, what it really means is you're not acting this way. That these things have gotten out of sorts, and your personalities are at war with each other, just like in 1 Corinthians. And so I think in a lot of ways the application is same for us as it was then, to be careful that we don't do that.
I guess I would put it, I know from the perspective of hindsight, and maybe someone who didn't go through that might see it that way. I think it was more a case in many instances of there were actual biblical issues at bay, but personalities got in the way of it.
Yeah.
I mean, often what happens is, and that, I think this is where these lessons from 1 Corinthians come in, even when we're discussing a relevant biblical issue, maybe it's an even bigger issue than the work of the church, which is the controversy you're talking about. Although, you know, I don't know how much bigger you can get than what does Christ want his body, his believers to do. That's a pretty big issue.
Yeah,
but,
let me say this, Steve. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the times when none of that is involved, and it's described as a personality issue. And two brethren can't get along, and they go start their own church. That's what I'm specifically referring to.
Yeah. And my point is that sometimes that happens even when there are big issues at bay.
Yeah.
That brethren get their personalities involved in it. But yes, I understand what you're saying, that there are times when brethren just don't like each other. And so they go off and start their own group, and you know, the Lord's church becomes known as something that's divisive rather than unitive. But I think the warning for us, I mean, to me personally, one of the applications is, even if you're talking about a very important biblical issue, not just, I don't like this guy, so I'm going to take my marbles and go somewhere else. I've got to watch the attitude that I bring to this controversy or this issue or this discussion or whatever it is, so that I don't allow my attitudes, my unloving nature, my exaltation, whatever it is, to get in the way of what this is really about, and it's not about me.
Yeah, I think there's a great way to think about this. One of the lessons I've learned from Steve over the years is to be careful with generalizations. I only know the number of churches that I can connect with, and my number of churches is different than Steve. The scope of my experiences is different than Terry's. I can make a generalization off of that and say this. Generally speaking, with those experiences in context, big issues are only made worse when we throw the gasoline of bad personalities onto it. And I think that's probably a likely outcome. And I think Lee makes a great point that that's a struggle that's going to be the next 2 to 3 months.
We're facing that.
You know, how do we decide to safely accommodate worship that our heart deeply desires? And we have different scales of comfort, especially in areas where we don't have personal expertise. I'm good with math, and I'm good with the Bible and tacos and a few other things. And so if you ask me questions about those things, I have some level of expertise. If you ask me about medical issues, I don't have that much expertise. I can call experts and I trust them. And so that's how I kind of work through this stuff. Everyone kind of works through those same things at different paces. And here's the valuable thing for the church at Corinth. Paul was giving them expertise. He was giving them at least two kinds of advice: wisdom that came from God, and potentially inspired wisdom that came from him, depending on how you want to work through his own comments. They had to work that out then personally. They had to apply it and do it. And so I will suggest that in many ways, verses 4 through 8a is in part teaching them the mechanism of application. So you could say, Steve talked about reading it as Steve, be kind. I think it's a great reading because Phil needs to be kind too. Corinth, be kind. Corinth, suffer long. Corinth, stop envying. And you could do it that way because all of those things are generally true. As we break down each of these aspects, I'll add one more thing. Terry mentioned this kind of generally. I'll add it more specifically. Each of these components definitely have a direct connection, as I read the text, to the challenges that they were personally facing. This was the same kind of stuff. The defrauding in the courts, the envy of position, the who's the big honcho on the scene, the who has and doesn't have in the Lord's Supper. They're all touched on in this list.
Yeah. One thing I like Lee's comment about what we're facing, and we were all three talking about ideas and potential plans and challenges, and that's a common discussion among guys like us when we get together. One of the things just to encourage people to do is apply these ideals towards your leadership during this time, because I don't serve as a shepherd like Phil does, but I'm involved in all those discussions to some degree. And I'm, if nothing else, sometimes just an observer. And I can tell you that there is a tremendous amount of anxiety going on during this time that you may not understand in this decision-making process. And so whatever your leadership decides, respond to that with patience and kindness and not being rude. You specifically think about these things because we all have our opinions and we all have our desires. One of the things you need to understand about that is we all want to be back together, meeting in the flesh as quickly as possible, worshiping God. That's what we all want. There's a lot of issues at bay with all of that. This is going to be one of those times where guys like Steve that are historians are going to talk about this time in the church, probably more than likely down the road, and the challenges we faced and how we handled those things. So in some kind of ways, you're part of a historical kind of thing, but just apply these things. And when they, just endure with patience and kindness. That's one of the just direct applications for us right
now. Steve, anything before we move into 8B? We kind of included 8A, kind of.
Let's go ahead so we don't have to sprint to the finish like just.
Yeah, that's why I'm trying to watch the clock again here. Steve, do you want to read verses 8 through 12 for us, if you could?
Yes, I won't read from the Message this time.
I was going to switch back for you. I was going to get right to that,
The Wolfgang approved version, right?
Yeah.
So this is the New American Standard, although I do like ESV also. So 8 through 12, 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Love never fails, but if there are gifts of prophecy, they will be done away. If there are tongues, they will cease. If there is knowledge, it will be done away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, the partial will be done away. When I was a child, I used to speak as a child, think as a child, reason as a child. When I became a man, I did away with childish things. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know fully, just as I also have been fully known.
So as I look at the text, and especially think through my experience of understanding, like new believer in Jesus, slightly more mature believer in Jesus, and then whatever I am right now, you can judge that on your own. My perception of this text has kind of matched what's been going on. My first introduction to this text was given as a new believer, and someone believed that I really needed to understand the timing of spiritual activity in the first century, 21st century. Uh, as I've matured, I've shifted my understanding of text a little bit, in that absolutely I'm not looking for modern day miraculous healings and modern day tongue speakings, but I don't necessarily see that as the primary reason that Paul is saying these things. He's teaching them something else that we then make a leveraged conclusion of to apply into the question of, are these things ongoing? And I didn't see that as a new believer. It's not at all a condemnation of the fellows who were teaching me as a new believer either. It has a whole lot to do with I just didn't know a lot of stuff. So what do you guys see here in the text that you want to bring out? And I brought that little thing on the table to start with, but what's important to you all when you look at the scriptures here?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of, as you say, a lot of layers of the onion here. Last night, I mean, part of this turns on, what is the perfect? What is he talking about here? The larger picture, and I think you're absolutely correct to emphasize this, is that whatever profit the gifts have, they are temporary. They are going to cease. And this enters into this discussion. When will the perfect be here? I guess is the question. When will what's permanent, what never dies, as the message have it, or what never fails, when will that endure after these temporary gifts pass away? And that, in the larger context, is one of the things that makes the love superior by far. It's the more excellent way than any gift that someone may have, even if it's a miraculous gift. And I with Logos, you can stack up 15 commentaries in a matter of seconds. So I'm whipping through some of these just to see if somebody has come up with some kind of new wrinkle. Generally speaking, you'll read it's either the second coming of Christ or heaven or the end of time or the inauguration of the new heavens and new earth, different wrinkles and nuances to that. Or it's the completion of the New Testament, the closing of the canon, to put it in more or less technical terms, or it's some variation of when the church comes to maturity. Well, okay, and I don't want to get a sidetracked into this particular issue, but I don't think you can ignore it in a reading of this passage. Somebody tell me when was it that the church has come to maturity? And most of them are speaking in denominational terms of some universal church concept. But to go back to Terry's point, when has the church or a given local church even been able to get to a place of maturity that it doesn't need spiritual guidance? I don't know when that happens.
Yeah.
If this is talking about something about the end of time, the coming of Christ, the inauguration of the new heavens and new earth, whatever it is, heaven, how are faith and hope going to abide when what is now seen in that context is no longer, hope, Romans 8:24, what we have, we don't hope for. Hebrews chapter 11, what is seen is not faith. So I think that runs into a whole bucket of issues with that interpretation. So I don't see a way around some idea that when we have the revelation of the mind of God in a form that everybody can read and the letters can be circulated even before they were put together in a codex, everybody now who has access to that information, Paul in Ephesians, knows the mind of God. You have my understanding of the mystery of Christ. So it's difficult for me to get around that tent peg, if you will.
Yeah.
I will just put that on the table and let you guys explain to me what that means, okay?
Well,
Careful.
one of the things I've always had trouble with any other interpretation of perfect than that is that it completely ignores the context surrounding the word perfect. It is an assumption that this word perfect has to be something that is like Jesus without flaw. And the issue with that is simply that it just doesn't fit the context. What fits the context is there's all of this in the word. Maybe complete would be better for our understanding, but what fits is you have all of these things that are partial, but when they come together in a complete form, they're not needed anymore. So all of that context points to exactly what you're saying, and this idea that the word and knowledge is all together, in a way that man could access it. And therefore, it's not needed for it to be delivered in these small personal chunks anymore in that sense. Maybe to describe it in a little less scholarly way. But that's always been my understanding of this text.
Well, I think it's, there's a variety of challenges in teaching this text to new believers. There's a variety of challenges in applying it to maturing believers. And you see that at Corinth, because they were once new believers, now they're maturing believers, and Paul is trying to teach them about a future that they can't really grasp. I think Keith is right to once again come out of the matrix and tell us that there's a context that they're clinging to something that's temporary. And I'll say in a general sense, all of us do that. We hold on to the temporary things because we don't understand the eternal things. And so Paul is in part trying to teach them that the things that they think are really important now really aren't that important at all. No different than what Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount. No different than what Solomon writes about, the wise king writes about in Ecclesiastes. That's not there's no surprise there with that reality. I do find it interesting that in this take of the text, he shrinks down his list a little bit and identifies a few things rather than all the gifts. And he does so in a way, and this helps me lead to my personal understanding that really is he's talking about the completed revelation of God. I do think that's probably the best reading of perfect. You don't have to have a Greek degree to figure that out because the terminologies are reflective of with one another. Perfect is the conclusion of the partials. Verse 10 is a way to think through that. But you see that clay he's making. Where does all this come from? It comes from the completed work of God. It comes from the complete who is Jesus, because he really is the complete manifestation of God on earth. Like, you want to know who God is? Look at him. So there's a lot of plays back and forth. And that's why I understand some people struggle with what is this talking about? Because it is a multi-layered onion of a big type.
Paul uses a triad twice here, contrastively. I mean, you go back to verse, they're going to fail, cease, and vanish. In most translations, render one or another variation of that sort of thing. These miraculous gifts, which are good gifts, but they are temporary gifts. They are not always going to have a place compared with faith, hope, and love abide. All three of them abide.
Yeah.
Now, of that triad, love is the greatest. The greatest of these is love. But faith and hope are good things, and they will abide until we get to a point where faith becomes sight, where hope is realized. And so the question, again, to restate it, is when will that happen? But even in his use of the emphatic triads here, the idea is don't get hung up on the gift, the specific miraculous gift that may have been given to you. And on the other hand, and this sometimes comes to play when you're maybe even in the present day dealing with someone who believes that they have some miraculous gift and begins to, whether in a stated way or implicitly, look down their nose spiritually at somebody who doesn't have it, as though somehow your faith is defective if you can't do some kind of glossolalia, however you want to describe that. I don't believe I published an article probably 30 years ago now in which I just looked at a lot of the psychological literature. You can visit the Holy Spirit room at Oral Roberts University or any collection of hundreds of thousands of hours of audio and videotape of people doing glossolalia. You will find zero, I mean none, zip, nada, instances of somebody doing that in a language that they haven't studied, that's spoken by somebody on the face of the earth. Now they may do it if they studied German when they were a kid, or they lived in Mexico and they picked up some Spanish, and that comes out in some kind of ecstatic or some sort of thing. And you might get some phonemes occasionally that might sound like a language, but in terms of what you see in the kind of gold standard norm of Acts chapter 2, for people speaking in extended sentences and paragraphs that explain complicated fairly complicated subjects of how this is how an Old Testament text applies. This is what David meant and so forth. You don't find any of that in modern day tongue speaking. And so if somebody's looking down their nose because they can string a few phonemes together and they think somehow that makes them spiritually superior to someone else, that's a total misreading of this text. But we can also do that even if we don't claim to have some kind of miraculous gift. And I think that gets us back to this main point, and that is that you need to look for the greater gifts, faith, hope, and love, if you will. And of those, the greatest of these is love. Circle back to the first part of the chapter. If I don't have that, I got nothing.
And I think it's a great comment, Steve. I think one of the things that's really interesting is to put this verse 11 in the context of all of this, which I think is carefully crafted by Paul, and just saying in a way, you all need to grow up spiritually, that you're acting childishly about these gifts when maturity in the spiritual sense realizes that faith, hope, and love are the things that you pursue more than the gifts. And in a way, the gifts are a way to get to the faith, hope, and love for them, to have that understanding and to develop that. But they're so focused, childishly so, on the vehicle rather than the destination in that sense. And so there's kind of this, for lack of a better term, this kind of charge. Hey, y'all need to grow up. You need to mature. And I think that you don't need to pass over that. I think this example of childishness is specifically tailored to this point for that purpose, for them to understand you're being immature when you do these things. You're not acting like adults. And so it's interesting. In chapter 3, he goes, you're just behaving like men. And now he's saying, you're just a bunch of kids. You're just a bunch of little children right now. And you need to actually behave more mature than you are. So I just don't want that to be passed over in this so much in this text here.
Yeah, I'll add this. I think a way we can understand it is to kind of put it into some additional boxes that are more modern to kind of see what Paul is pushing at. So in the context of the letter to the Corinthians and in their strife with one another, they had misvalued what God was accomplishing in them and placed this weird structure on it. And so Paul, like Terry is pointing out, is saying, you guys need to grow up. Steve and I have a friend, Terry knows him too, who is not a very talented singer by any means. Mike Willis is an excellent Bible student. It's a struggle to stay on key sitting next to him. What's more exciting is to have him between you and his son, which his son Corey is a great song leader. And so that's just utter chaos for me. My ears can't hear all that at once. And yet, Mike sings with enthusiasm. He sings with a deep appreciation for who God is. And so you have an interesting illustration of a clanging cymbal that's seeking to be the rising dove. And that's what God wants. He really wants us to be able to squeeze in like that spiritually and see that this stuff that we think matters doesn't, because it's not what God is looking for. He's not looking for the tonality of our voice. He's looking for the heart.
Exactly. I mean, this is not talking about somebody who doesn't have perfect pitch or can't execute. I mean, this is somebody who's arrogant and egotistical and self-focused and, always talking about or saying or doing things that will leave an impression, perhaps with at least the uninitiated, that somehow I'm special and I have something you don't have, and that sets me apart from you. This is supposed to bring us together because of the love that we share for the Lord Jesus Christ first, and for each other, whoever else loves the Lord Jesus Christ, because he died for the person who's singing off key, which may be me from time to time.
Yeah.
And he died for people that I disagree with, and I can't allow the manner in which I may engage someone with a disagreement, even, if it's over the resurrection or something that everybody would agree is core to the faith. I can't behave in such a way that I've got all this knowledge, or somehow God's given me a gift that he didn't give you, so you need to pay attention to me. And that's the problem, as Phil pointed out, going all the way back through these chapters in First Corinthians that have been a part of this series.
And I'll add this. And then the last little tidbit for you, and not coronavirus, just allergies. We're getting through that season. The last step of this is to make a note about this. we need to become careful readers of the scriptures. We need folks who are willing to help guide us in the understanding of areas we don't know well, and language is an important tool. The term tongue that gets utilized regularly in the New Testament for languages gets then manipulated to mean any number of things. In the simple reading of Acts chapter 2, like Steve pointed out, whatever it was that the apostles were speaking were languages that the audience understood. And so that's a consistent use case in the New Testament where it says tongues. The word there actually is languages. It's just translated tongues because someone liked the way it sounded in the modern translations as opposed to its original use. And we just kind of leave it there.
I mean, it's a word that comes from the word for tongue. So, yeah.
Yep. And we just kind of leave it there and it sounds good. But realize it's a language. You can understand it if you're born into it, is the context there. And that's the real important part for me is when I think back to what's taking place, you have people who were not born into a language who are either legitimately or illegitimately acting like they have the gift or they actually have the gift. And people are jealous about it. They're jealous that this person has this thing and that makes them better than they are when none of that is true. The reality is you need one another. And I love that Paul will go later down the road and say, hey, look, you know what? If there's no one there to understand, have a seat. And guess what? You can choose to have a seat. Even if God has given you the gift, he's also given you the gift of choice to sit down. And I know you guys have done this. I know I do this sometimes when I'm in a Bible class and I've got something I want to say. And remember, it's not my turn. I'll have another turn later down the road and it'll be okay. So moving in the text, last clause of the verse there, verse 13, we've kind of hinted at it. I'll read it for us real quickly. So now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. And like Steve pointed out early, it's the greatest, it's not the only. These other things have value too. It's a pinnacle that we've stepped to. Hope that's been a great study for everybody. We'll go around the horn first. Terry, last comments, last shout outs, things you want people to know of, sports stats. What you got?
Well, sadly, there are no sports stats, but there is one stat, and that is that we did not go to the garden at all today. So a little disappointed in that. We're setting a precedent. I don't know if Phil has lost his touch or
I
what.
could have, but I didn't.
Yeah. So just a reminder, we won't be back till Tuesday. And I probably won't be on Tuesday, although I think Phil will. So we'll have to have a sub. I'll be traveling back as a lot of us are heading south to load up our sons and daughters' remains from their dormitories. And I don't know what Phil's afraid of, but I'm literally afraid of what I'm walking into Monday afternoon. My child's a little worse than Jesse. There is no idea. I have no idea. There's no telling.
Just burn
what
it.
mess
Just
we'll be cleaning up from pork chop. So prayers for us in our travels. And Phil, I'll see you Monday afternoon.
Yeah, 6 feet.
Yep, 6 feet.
Steve, what you got?
Well, I don't have miraculous knowledge or often even insider knowledge, so I'm puzzling over what's the in the garden reference, which came up on Terry's screen backwards. So I was trying to have the gift of interpretation to figure out what was going on here. So off camera, you guys can explain this to me.
Okay.
So I will have perfect knowledge of what I need to know. But again, the last thought to go back, and since I've got the message open, the point of this text is I sound like a rusty gate, or I'm bankrupt without love. Those are not literal, but they catch the sense of what this text is about. If I am not behaving with love toward my brethren and toward those who need to experience the love and grace of God and have not done that yet, and I'm simply trying to promote myself or my own knowledge or something, then I am the clanging cymbal. I am the cowbell. Thanks for the study. Enjoyed it.
Hope you guys have a nice afternoon. You get outside a little bit, maybe fire up the barbecue like others will as the weekend is upon us. And a reminder that in all things, God really is seeking to bless you. And we've closed each of these series of studies with a reminder of that truth. And so we'll do so again today. We really want you to know that all spiritual blessings are found in Christ. If we can help you find it some way, please reach out to us, and may God bless you in whatever He has in plans for you.